Hey there folks, Wrel here. Today we'll be taking a look at the NS-AM7 Archer, which is an anti-material rifle available to the Engineer class in PlanetSide 2. We'll break down the statistics, talk about how it fits into the game, and whether or not you'll find it useful for your personal playstyle. The Archer will run 1000 certs or 700 daybreak cash to unlock, and it also has access to black and gold versions for additional cash. It's a primary weapon that trades viability against infantry for the ability to easily drop max units and also deal limited damage to enemy vehicles. Because of its inability to handle infantry, be prepared to run around with your pistol out for a lot of the time. And it probably goes without saying, but you want to be using a pistol that you can actually kill things with pretty well. I'd recommend either the Commissioner or the Underboss as your go-to, then the Spiker for the VS, the Desperado for the NC, and the Emperor or Repeater for the TR depending on how much range you want to squeeze out. These pistols all have good damage output on the first trigger squeeze, except for the Emperor, which just has a little bit more range, and that's useful for dealing with full health enemies start to finish. That said, the Archer deals 400 damage up to 10 meters, and then drops off to 300 damage at 125 meters. It also has a headshot multiplier of only 1.5 times, or possibly 1.55 times. Keep in mind though that this is the damage that's displayed in-game, and in-game damage displays are in relation to how much damage it deals against standard infantry. All other vehicles, including max units, are going to have resistance multipliers that modify the damage received. That said, here's a chart that shows how many shots to kill most targets at point blank range. Most of this work is done by Solace of Thorns, and he posted it up on Reddit, so major props there for taking the time to put this together, and if you want to visit the Reddit thread, I've linked that in the video description below, so you can thank him personally for all of his hard work, as well as see the actual resistance values instead of just the number of shots to kill. What you can easily take away from this chart is that infantry die in 2 headshots, or 3 to 4 body shots. Max units also die in 2 headshots or 3 to 4 body shots depending on the range, and flash ATVs will also die in 3 shots. The next best targets come in the form of ESF and harassers, and against everything else, you're more or less an annoyance, your supplemental damage, though it does work well for finishing off burning vehicles. While the damage numbers look pretty decent, the Archer's rechamber time is 2 seconds. It's the rechamber time that severely limits the weapon's damage output and makes it such a specialty tool instead of giving you something that you can use in more situations. You have 5 rounds per magazine with 25 in reserve, and that sounds low overall, but you are playing as the Engineer, so ammo isn't a huge concern. The reload times are pretty substantial at 3 seconds short and 4.25 seconds long, but since you have to rechamber the weapon after each shot except for the last shot, the one that empties the magazine, your short reload is actually longer than your long reload, at 5 seconds flat. The projectile velocity isn't the most amazing thing in the world at 525 meters per second, and against enemy vehicles is completely fine, but at longer ranges, both max units and infantry can avoid your shots pretty easily, whether they're trying to or not. Now the hipfire accuracy is surprisingly good for a weapon that's meant to deal with long-range combat. This means that you can easily peek corners and hipfire max units, especially if you equip a laser sight, which you also have access to. Even against enemy aircraft or vehicles, scoping in isn't always necessary, provided your reticule can encompass the target. The aim down sight's accuracy while standing is fine, about as good as it needs to be for a precision weapon, but if you're moving, that accuracy takes a pretty considerable hit, so it's only dependable against enemy vehicles at long range. Last thing as far as statistics go is that the Archer is also a 0.75 times aim down sight's movement speed weapon, meaning that you move at 75% of your normal movement speed instead of the 50% that most weapons offer. Now this isn't a huge benefit on this weapon since your hipfire is already really good to begin with, and dealing with enemy infantry isn't your strong suit in the first place, but it is still nice to have. As far as attachment options go, the Archer has access to a 4x triple chevron optic by default, as well as optics 7x through 12x. It does not currently have access to a 6x optic, which is not only strange, but it may also throw you off if you're used to sniping with the 6x and compensating for the bullet drop that way. The 4x optic doesn't have any scope sway, and that's useful for most situations, except for really long-range infantry sniping or pinpoint sniping, which the weapon isn't really so suited for in the first place. Also, in addition to the standard 4x triple chevron, you can also unlock a 4x crosshair reticule. That's the Quadra. I highly suggest you unlock this because a crosshair reticule is much easier to use than a triple chevron because it has a lot more clarity. You shouldn't ever need more than a 7x optic if you feel like sniping from range, because the weapon just isn't great there thanks to the projectile velocity. Not to mention, against quicker targets like ESF and harassers, too much zoom is a bad thing, as you won't be able to track those targets as easily. In addition to scope selection, you also have access to a DARKLIGHT, please don't use it, straight pull bolt, and a laser sight. In the background footage, I'm using a laser on my VS character and a straight pull on my TR character. This is mostly so you can see how each of them performs. The laser sight, in my opinion, is far and away the better option based on the ranges at which this weapon is useful. The straight pull bolt will immediately start rechambering the weapon instead of forcing you to scope out, and this is useful for maximizing your damage output on a target, especially if you're the type of player who likes to watch the shot fly so that they can verify the hit and decide whether or not they're leading the target right. But straight pull bolts are mostly meant for hastening your follow-up shots, which really isn't necessary for the archer because you aren't trying to snipe and finish infantry, and your chamber time is crazy long. It's better to just get into the practice of leaving the scope as soon as you fire so that the weapon starts rechambering. At close quarters you'll be doing this anyway since mobility is your friend, and at long range you're likely to get counter-sniped if you don't. While using the archer, you should not expect to get many kills, and the kills that you do get will probably feel more like kill steals than anything else. Infantry will likely run away after the first shot, max units will likely go into a corner and cower there after the first or second shot, and you don't do enough damage to drop anything else that isn't already on fire. Even so, that's not to say that the archer doesn't have an important role to play. You aren't the only person on the battlefield, so being able to push a max unit into cover means that they stop harping on your vehicles. If you see a Raven Max or a Burster Max defending a tower, you can easily force them back into the spawn room. Speaking of, as a vehicle pilot, there's very little reason not to have an archer equipped. I guess unless you play at closer ranges where enemy infantry are trying to jump all over your vehicle. When anti-vehicle max units are perched on a hill and you either don't have the right vehicle loadout to deal with them, or you can't pin them down with your main gun, you'll be able to park your vehicle behind a rock and then just plink away at them until they leave you alone. That's a pretty powerful feature to have. Another benefit of being able to plink targets from range is when dealing with base turrets. You do a considerable amount of damage to mounted turrets, so this is a good option to have when you know that the enemy is trying to shore up defenses or when you just want to make sure that they don't get the chance to. And since you can do it from a world away, the chances of you getting dropped are much lower than the guy who needs to make sure that his rocket lines up just right. When it comes to fighting at close to mid-range or indoors, the archer is outstanding at hip-firing max units for big damage with few downsides. Unlike the Heavy's rocket launcher that requires a bit more time to aim and has a much slower projectile, you can get about the same damage, you avoid the partial mitigation from flak armor, which most max units tend to run at the moment, and a miss doesn't suck as much since your rechamber time is still lower than any rocket launcher's reload speed. Granted, you don't have an overshield, but if you're not the only focus of attention, the archer is a really scary weapon for max units to deal with. One of the coolest and probably unintended quirks of this weapon is that, since it's technically counted as a small arms weapon, you can shoot through vehicle shields. This is hugely powerful in the right circumstances. We've all seen those fights where enemy vehicles are playing peekaboo through their vehicle shield. They'll pop out, they'll deal some damage, and then they'll pop back in to repair with no concerns. What the archer can do is put pressure on all of those vehicles, so that they get out of the line of sight of the shield, which in turn will let your allied vehicles move up. Now the catch here is that the strategy isn't very effective unless you have a handful of archers working together. You'll maybe be able to pick off enemy vehicles that are on fire, but outside of that, the damage from a single archer isn't going to do much in this situation. But the possibility is definitely there. Outside of this, however, overloading your squad with archers is, at least from a damage perspective, more of a gimmick than anything else. Now don't get me wrong, it's the same gimmick that makes Lancer squads worthwhile, being the big burst damage at extremely long ranges, but the Archer is basically a worse version of the Lancer in this respect, since it doesn't have access to the same projectile velocity, or the same damage, or even the ability to be used on a class that can soak incoming damage. Now it's not horrible, it's just gimmicky, because it takes a very specific situation for you to not want to pull a heavy with a lock-on, or an AV max or an AA max instead. Squads with a bunch of archers should be thought of less for their ability to kick out damage, and more for the ability to actually repair and support nearby Sunderbirds or vehicles or max units, while also providing supplemental damage to other units you have access to. So in other words, it should be more about the fact that you're an engineer, and less about the fact that you have this really fun toy. When equipping the archer, since you're effectively disarming yourself against infantry, you should be bridging this lack of offense in a couple of different ways. The first is a good sidearm. We talked about this toward the beginning, but you probably want to pick up a commissioner or an underboss if you don't already own one, or you go for the spiker for VS, the desperado for NC, and the emperor or the default repeater for TR. Outside of that, it's a good idea to also run your default anti-infantry monoturret. Having an AI monoturret means that you'll have cover whenever you need it, and this will let you work your pistol a little bit better in close quarters, and it means the ability to actually deal with enemy infantry under more specific circumstances where an anti-infantry monoturret does well. And if you're pulling out the archer for anti-max duty, chances are that you'll want both of these options available to you. Overall, the archer is a very specific tool meant primarily to deal with enemy max units. Fortunately, it can do this at practically any range thanks to the super tight hipfire and various scoped attachments, but it trades a lot in the process. Running an archer will force you into a support role unless you're like Clint Eastwood with a revolver, and because of that, it's not exactly a good option for newer players, or for players who still have things they would like to start into. It's a nice tool to have on standby, but it's nothing you should rush out to purchase. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and if you have any thoughts on the archer, go ahead and share them in the comment section down below. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.